Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Corn Board.
When we transform Nebraska corn into ethanol, it doesn't disappear from the food supply. It just takes a little detour. Ethanol is made from the starch. The rest of the corn becomes livestock feed to create meat and dairy products, corn oil, sweetener, and other food ingredients, and maybe a little carbon dioxide to make your soft drinks fizzy. Homegrown ethanol helps satisfy America's hunger for energy and the world's appetite for feed and food. Nebraska's family corn farmers, sustaining innovation.
Market Journal, television for agricultural business decisions, is a presentation of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine, and major funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Corn Board.
Welcome to this week's edition of Market Journal. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. On this episode, Roy Smith looks at historical price trends for corn and soybeans. Derrell Peel gives an overview of U.S. beef exports. Benny Mote talks about biosecurity on hog operations. And Brian Krienke discusses fall nitrogen applications. Roy Smith is our corn and soybean market analyst this week. Nebraska is expected to be the third largest grower of corn and fifth biggest producer of soybeans this harvest. The projected average corn yield of 181 bushels per acre is down 4 bushels from last year, but the record-setting 61 bushels per acre predicted in soybeans is 3 bushels higher. We'll learn more about supply and demand elements next Wednesday when the USDA releases its November crop report. We talked with Roy Wednesday afternoon about the dead cat bounce, basis movement, and harvest progress in his area of southeast Nebraska.
Right here in Cass County, the progress has been really good. Not record, I don't think, because we have had a few small rains, but pretty happy seeing those beans and that corn going down the road.
How does the yield look?
Yield is wonderful. It's just almost unbelievable. I hate to say how much it is for people misinterpreting what I'm saying, but let's just say more than I've ever had before.
Let's start off in soybeans. Update me on the tracking of the dead cat bounce.
I start tracking the dead cat bounce middle of September. We had a major harvest low just a couple of days after that, 14th or 15th, somewhere in there. And then the market kind of came back up, rebounded, and really we thought that cat was asleep there for a while because for 2 months nothing happened. Little up and little down, up, little down. And then one day it seemed like the cat came to life, and we had a real nice run up for a very short period of time. From beginning to end was about 3 weeks. Here early part of this week where we saw then it sell off, and it's hard to say whether the dead cat bounce is going to continue or if it's all over with. But the one thing I know is it gave us an opportunity to sell cash soybeans at very favorable levels, and for that we are thankful.
Yeah, I'll ask you for a refresher, people that aren't familiar with your tracking of the dead cat bounce, your triggers of what you're looking for.
First of all, we look for a major low somewhere around harvest time, and like I said earlier, we got it earlier this year than normal. I look for 35 cents a bushel above that harvest low. I prefer to see 50 cents a bushel, and on occasion we'll see $1 a bushel. That occasion doesn't come very often, and it didn't quite make it this year. As I calculated from the Midwest Co-op bid sheets, it looked like the bounce amounted to about 85 cents. And it was long, and it lasted long enough for people to pull the trigger if they were ready to sell. And in fact, I did get my beans sold in that $9 cash area. It wasn't quite, I didn't quite get the top, but I got close enough to the top I could smell it almost.
We've talked a lot about soybeans. What are your thoughts on corn and how it's moved?
Corn has been really frustrating, and I have most of my corn still on hand, as you're well aware. It just goes up and down a little bit. Even the move that took soybean futures up and down by a factor of 60 or 70 cents a bushel. Might have gotten 10 cents or 15 cents out of the corn market, but not much more than that. And my hope and hope for lots of people is that after the first of the year, after we get this harvest out of the way, that we'll see some life in the corn market. We certainly haven't had it up to this point to where farmers want to sell. We might get 4 or 5 cents, or extreme cases a dime, but that's about it.
Do you have any targets in place for corn, or is it just a wait-and-see game once you get to January?
I'll set the targets around the 1st of January. The corn's in the bin, it's dry, it's safe, and we can worry about something else for a couple of months. And so I don't necessarily set a target like that. I'll be looking at what the price of corn is around January 1st, and we'll set some targets out there to know when to move the corn.
Finally, a quick look at basis here as we close out.
Basis has been absolutely wild. There for a couple of months it did nothing. It looked like the basis didn't even exist, and then as harvest progressed and people saw how many beans are actually out there and what they're doing with them, we've seen basis moves overnight almost by a matter of a nick or a dime a bushel, a dime a bushel, and then it'll back off, and maybe a different elevator in a different location will have a different basis. And so it pays to watch the basis. Even though what you're selling is cash, the basis does relate to that, and it's very important.
Next week, North Dakota State Extension economist Frayne Olson will join us to analyze the USDA's November crop report. We also have a look at cattle markets this week with Oklahoma State Extension's Derrell Peel. Commercial cattle slaughter during 2015 was the smallest since 1963. USDA statistics released last week show the total was down 5% from 2014, but live weights were the heaviest on record. The process of rebuilding the U.S. cow herd is difficult to predict, as the USDA didn't release its usual July inventory report. The only data of the year came in January. There is an abundant supply of beef in the country. September's cold storage report showed a record high amount for the month, with data dating back to 1932. The export market showed positive signs in August, as total beef and veal shipments were nearly 30% higher than August 2015 and the highest monthly total in 2 years. We talked with Derrell Tuesday morning and began by asking about current price movements in live and feeder cattle markets.
Well, I think there's a couple things going on. One is, of course, I think we went too low this fall. We've been in kind of a real bearish, scared kind of a sense for the last couple of months. And so this market took a long time to kind of find some footing, and it was kind of across the board, but we've seen that now. So we're seeing fed cattle prices improve a little bit, feeder cattle prices have ticked up, and boxed beef prices have begun to improve a little bit.
I should ask about what we're seeing for the current expansion, or the rate of expansion with heifer retention numbers and cow slaughter numbers. Does it tell you anything about where the industry is?
Well, of course, we didn't get any mid-year data, so we don't have any official numbers, but if you look at heifer slaughter numbers have increased through the year. Early in the year, they were still down year over year, but they switched to being above, and really for the last half of the year so far, they've been double-digit above a year ago. On the cow slaughter side, sort of the same story. Most of the year, beef cow slaughter has been above last year's record low levels, at least record low as a percent of the cow herd. So, you look at that, it's pretty clear we're slowing down expansion. There are people suggesting that expansion has stopped, and maybe even that we're back in liquidation. I really don't think that's the case. If you look at the cow slaughter rate and what we project to be at for the whole year by the time we get to the end of the year, we still have a net cow culling rate that's less than average in the U.S. It's not as low as last year's record low was, but it's still below average. So I think, it's pretty clear we're still expanding the herd somewhat in 2016. Much as we had planned, it was already in place. I think the bigger question is, how much have we slowed it down, perhaps even stopped it going into 2017? That's a little more difficult to call. I would look for still limited but very small expansion in 2017. What
do you think margins look like right now?
Well, obviously it depends on who you are, as is often the case, and they've switched a lot. Cow-calf producers, which enjoyed extremely strong margins here for the last 2 or 3 years in particular, obviously now are feeling the squeeze with these sharply lower prices, again, somewhat lower even maybe than what they really needed to be, in my opinion. But, you know, stocker producers, it's been really hard this fall to get stocker demand jump-started, and yet if you look at feeder cattle prices, there's actually a fairly strong incentive in terms of the gross margin potential for stocker producers. The market's sort of encouraging this bigger run of calves that we have this fall to not come to town too fast, and feedlot demand has been pretty weak for lightweight calves, fairly stable and for the heavier weight calves, and all of that translates into an incentive for cattle to stay out in the country. So there's margin potential for retaining calves in a stocker backgrounding program as well as for the stockers. Feedlots, of course, are struggling again, have been until at least this last uptick in fed cattle prices. It's been tough for them to get that, get those margins rebalanced for them. Packers and retailers, of course, are enjoying strong margins right now with the supply pressures weakening their input costs in both cases, and still, slowly adjusting down those output prices.
Let's talk about one of the positive aspects. Export demand in August was very good. We saw big increases to Japan, South Korea, and Mexico. Any particular reason why?
Well, I think it's basic market forces at work. Prices are lower in the U.S., so we would expect to see demand in the international market recover in terms of the quantity will move at lower prices, much as we see in the domestic market. And so that's fundamentally it. And supplies are bigger. So, we have more product. We have it priced more reasonably as demand works. We're still fighting a bit the headwind of a strong dollar, but the strong dollar doesn't usually completely offset market forces. It has the potential to either moderate or accentuate those, and it's certainly still moderating, providing some resistance to those exports, but we're seeing the export demand recover pretty much as expected.
I should ask to close out with, what is international production like in other countries? What are they putting out for beef?
Well, one of the bigger changes in global markets is in Australia. The situation in Australia has been unique relative to the U.S. market in particular. Australia has gone through a serious drought that was about 2 years behind the drought in the U.S. So they're really kind of doing the same thing we did, but a couple of years later, in that they had a couple of years of forced liquidation, which increased production. It coincided with the high prices in the U.S., for example, and provided an opportunity for them to greatly increase exports in 14 and 15 into the U.S. Now they're on the backside of that with some drought recovery going on. Their herd is at a 20-something year low. And so beef production is restricted and will be restricted for the next 2 or 3 to more years longer as they rebuild this herd. And so they're in a reduced supply situation right now, and that's going to give the U.S. an opportunity, as our supplies are already growing, to step into those markets in a little bit bigger way.
The USDA will release export totals for the month of September on Monday. The November Nebraska farmer says buying seed isn't as simple as it was 2 decades ago. This month's issue says Tony Johansson of Oakland looks at seed selection and purchases very carefully because those decisions have a tremendous impact on crop income. According to Johansson, seed buying has changed primarily because of the genetic potential and agronomic traits now available. You can learn more about his seed buying philosophies as well as some timely tips to keep in mind when buying seed in the November Nebraska Farmer. Since June 5, 2014, more than 2,800 sites across 39 states have recorded a positive test for the Porcine Epidemic Diarrhea virus. Nearly 1,200 of those are in Iowa, far and away more than any other state. 70 of the premises are in Nebraska. It's important to point out that PEDV was first confirmed in the spring of 2013, and preliminary reports show October has only one confirmed case. That was in Wisconsin. Earlier this week, we talked with Nebraska Extension swine specialist Benny Mote to find out what the industry has learned about biosecurity from the virus.
The first thing we learned is we're not as clean as we thought we were. There are several ways that microorganisms or viruses were traveling across and into our barns that PED made us think twice about. Feed was definitely one of the first ones. With some of the ingredients in feed being sourced from different animal byproducts, really make us think about the whole processing that they have And then the other big one is transportation, both of the livestock and the feed and the vehicles themselves.
So learning from that, is there anything people can do on their operations, those simple fixes or the necessary fixes they can make to help better prepare themselves or better defend their operations?
First and foremost, having clean vehicles is the number one thing they can do, especially your transportation vehicles. Make sure they're clean. Make sure you know where the trucks are coming from. If they're coming off-site, make sure that they are cleaned, especially between farms. Disinfectant baths, spraying down tires as they're pulling into the yard. Those are all some of the basics that everybody, regardless of the size of the operation, can do. As you get a little bigger and get a little more complicated, having the trucks go through the washing and baking bays is always good, but first and foremost, just make sure the vehicles are clean when they come onto your farm.
You're doing some discussions around the state and around the topic of biosecurity and the veterinary feed directive. One of the aspects is how can biosecurity help reduce antibiotic use? What does that mean?
Well, it's kind of a broad topic, but if we start off with healthier animals, then we won't need to reach for those antibiotics to keep them healthy. And so if we can start high health, stay high health, then we won't have to go to those, because nobody wants to use antibiotics in the feed. Contrary to what some people think, we don't reach for them first. It's something we add to them, and there is a cost to that. And that's something I would like the public to know, is when we do that, we're paying for the cost to make sure we keep our animals healthy.
So is it realistic to say that the industry can reduce some of the use of antibiotics while maintaining animal welfare?
I believe so. There's going to be a learning curve. There are things that we were used to using that's going to take a little bit more time for us to figure out. We still have access to those, but we're going to have to go through the vets more to get those. I think some of the smaller producers are going to have a little harder time than maybe the big ones will, because the big companies usually have their vets on staff. So the people are going to get to know our veterinarians very well.
Yeah, those smaller operations, what are some of the instances where you see that they might need the approval of a veterinarian now, that whether or not they see that coming is going to happen?
I actually see that for any time they're going to mix feed, where before they're used to be able to get some of their feed grade medications like CTC over the counter, and that's one of the ones that people will reach for first to go into the nursery feed. That's one where if they're going to continue to use that, they're going to have to go through a vet to get that.
How prepared do you think the industry is for the veterinary feed directive?
Moderate, and which scares me a little bit, because that deadline's coming up here very fast. There's one of the areas I think it hurts us a little bit. It's going to be on the extreme smaller producers that do mix feed, and then actually the 4-H and FFA kids with some of their show pig. They just aren't aware of that. We're starting to get the word out. We just aren't doing a very good job of that yet.
You can find more information about the veterinary feed directive, including our previous interviews, through the Market Journal website. Nebraska farmers have harvested 69% of this season's corn and 91% of this year's soybeans. According to the Nebraska Mesonet, soil temperatures at 4 inches Thursday morning range from 50 degrees in northwest Nebraska to 62 degrees in the southeast corner. Those temperatures could come down more slowly than usual. The National Weather Service Climate Prediction Center shows all of Nebraska has an above-average chance for warmer than normal temperatures for the month of November. With milder weather, some growers might be thinking about fall nitrogen applications. Earlier this week, we talked with Nebraska Extension's Brian Krienke and asked if there were pros and cons to applying at this time of the year.
I would say mostly cons. From a standpoint of utilizing that nitrogen, from an efficient standpoint of putting your dollars where they make sense for your crop the next year. A crop can only take up nitrogen when there's a crop in the field, right? Pretty obvious statement. Now, there's a lot of reasons why growers would put their nitrogen on in the fall, and I'm not dismissing that. And those are usually logistical issues. The soil's dry, so they're not going to compact the soil as much, as opposed to waiting in the spring during planting, where they've got dual labor demands on them. So it's very hard to deal with during planting time, and so a lot of people opt for the fall. We would really like to suggest not doing that from an efficiency standpoint, because there's so much exposure risk for that nitrogen now from when you apply in the fall until when that plant can actually take up and use that nitrogen. Let's talk about the spectrum of efficiency, the best ways to deal with nitrogen management. You know, on the one side, it's applying in the fall. The soil's warm, there's no crop there. That's the most inefficient way because of all the risks that nitrogen can encounter. Now you go all the way to the other side and we use things like the UNL algorithm, which we've published in several NEB guides. That's a great way to assume a rate that you might need for a growing season. But what we're really focused on now in university research and extension is moving to better ways of side dressing your nitrogen, and not just with a predetermined rate, but actually using information like computer models coupled with sensors that can detect the stress of the crop and applying as needed, as opposed to let's try to predict what the whole growing season needs now and then more than likely get it wrong.
Let's talk about temperature. How does that impact it?
Temperature is everything with anhydrous ammonia, and that's typically what's being applied in the fall. And that is, they're injecting in the ground, and the soil needs to be at least below 50 degrees Fahrenheit to inhibit the processes that convert that ammonium, which is what anhydrous turns into a leachable form nitrate. And so that process takes time, and it takes a warmer temperature for the microbial populations to do. And so that's why we always say wait at least until the soil is below 50 degrees to inhibit that.
So if somebody's out there now injecting, putting it in, let's say 50 to 55 degrees, what happens?
Well, obviously there's not a huge difference in terms of temperature there, but we would say don't do that. Wait until it gets below to be safe. There is still going to be this process that's converting it over. It's just going to be slower at 50 degrees than it would be at 55. And even better when it gets below 40 and so on.
Are there additional concerns from moisture when you talk about fall applications?
No, most of those are myths about the soil being too dry. It takes almost microscopic amounts of moisture to actually adhere and grab the anhydrous once it's injected, so that's not a concern. The biggest concern would be getting it injected deep enough so that next year when you plant over these bands that they're not going to inhibit and injure your seedlings.
What about soil sampling during the fall? Is that something that's recommended?
Yeah, so soil sampling is a great thing to do now if you're going to be applying the nutrients this fall. For nitrogen, it's not as ideal as waiting closer to the time of actual application because nitrogen has so many more processes taking place. But I would say if we were going to step out of the nitrogen conversation into other just general fertility, this is a great time to sample shallow for phosphorus, potassium, sulfur, some of your micros like iron if you've had issues with those in the past. If you are going to sample for nitrogen, do some deep sampling to help aid in your decision making. So take a shallow surface sample of 0 to 8 or 0 to 12 if it's only going to be nitrogen, and then go at least 3 feet down after that to get a composite average of how much nitrogen is currently in your soil, so you can account for that when you make your recommendations and apply your N.
We'll link to more resources about nitrogen applications on the Market Journal website. Now with this week's weather forecast, here's Nebraska Extension ag climatologist Al Dutcher.
Well, folks, here we again for the weekly forecast. I think the primary news over this last week once again was warm and dry. We had a little bit of precipitation move to the state on Wednesday, but very isolated in nature. Basically about 99.9% of the state really didn't receive anything more than just a sprinkle, if nothing more than a few clouds. And unfortunately, as we go forward in time, it looks to be the same concept. More dryness than more wetness. And unfortunately, above normal temperatures look to be the rule. But before we get to the main forecast, let's kind of take a look and see how the month of October fared out in terms of precipitation. As we go to the maps, what we'll notice is the heaviest concentration of precipitation over the eastern part of the state, and really there's only a small concentrated areas where we see less than or more than an inch of moisture, and then some right around the North Platte or just to the north of the North Platte area. But most of this white area is really basically a trace of precipitation or less, and unfortunately this is the same area where we've seen an upgrade in the drought monitor. So you can see that pivoting point up where we are bringing the nose of the dryness up into central to north central Nebraska, and we're also seeing an expansion in the Panhandle. We would expect that this will intensify over the next couple of weeks unless we start to see some significant moisture. So as we look at the upper air pattern today, what we'll notice is that there is a jet stream showing a big trough of the western United States, and we have a surface low in Colorado. This really isn't expected to move much. It's more of a feature of the surface. You can see it just kind of sits here, but you notice the jet stream starts to show a ridging pattern, and some of that energy will move move over the top of the ridge, and this low itself starts to fade out. And by doing that, the energy comes together and starts to move toward the southeast. So there is a chance for precipitation. Now, the latest model runs are basically cutting this low off on Tuesday and pivoting energy around it. So more likely we'll be looking at clouds with the heaviest precipitation on the eastern side. If this doesn't cut off and moves to the east, we'll see much warmer conditions. But if it moves to the west, we'll see an increase in precipitation. Overall, really not a lot of moisture resulting with this system, and we'll see the ridge start to build back in as we get into later next week. So we'll start to see the warmth return as another trough approaches the Pacific Northwest. In terms of precipitation, you can kind of see the remnants of this precipitation with this upper air lows. It tries to get itself organized over the central plains this weekend, and then starts to shift some of that moisture toward the north, but you can see it's very spotty in nature. And then as that other system comes down from the north and merges, we'll start to see most of the moisture on the cut up buffer low over the eastern corn belt, and it looks like it stays pretty much stationary until we get to late next week, and then it'll start to push off toward the northeast. Once again, if this moves a little bit farther toward the west, then we'll see this heavy precipitation starting to impact some more of the south central plains region. This does actually give a little bit of hope to the southeast in terms of moisture. We have seen a rapid expansion of dryness conditions in this region, and overall that's responsible for the ridge building up and blocking the movement of these troughs coming in. So we'll look to see whether or not this upper low does cut off and whether it can generate enough moisture to start breaking down the upper ridge that's been so dominant during the last 30 to 45 day period. In terms of the forecast from next Thursday through the following Tuesday, once again you can see the impact of above normal temperatures over the western 2/3 of the United States, and with that ridge in place, we are looking at dry conditions from the western United States all the way through the northeastern United States.
Thanks, Al. Today's interviews are available individually on the Market Journal website and through the Market Journal mobile app. They include information on corn and soybean markets, beef exports, biosecurity for pig producers, and fall nitrogen applications. As always, you can keep up with Market Journal during the week by following us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. Next week, Frayne Olson will recap the USDA's November crop report, and Paul Janot will discuss challenges facing the U.S. beef industry. Until then, thanks for watching. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. We'll see you next week.
Join Market Journal online at marketjournal.unl.edu. You can also follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine, and major funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Corn Board. Market Journal is produced by the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources.